listening to these talks, these are absolutely fascinating, and I really appreciate how much cutting-edge work you're doing. I hope after you see this talk, you'll understand that there's some very simple restorative approaches that are approved here in India as well, that are good opportunities to help a lot of patients in a much simpler fashion than some of the complicated stuff that was already shown today. So what I'll be showing is about sacral neuromodulation. We'll talk about some of the indications and some of the basic workups. And these are things that I see on a regular basis every day. For sacral neuromodulation cases, I do about 10 to 20 a month. So this is something we see a lot of patients. I've changed the scope of the lecture to really more appeal to many of you in the setting of neurologic disease, neurologic injuries, and we can talk about how that role has been refined more and more. So let's look at some of the patient indications. So our typical indication is overactive bladder. Many of you are aware what overactive bladder is. Typically it's urinary urgency, frequency, urge incontinence. We also look at non-obstructive urinary retention. So as a urologist, many people would see obstructive urinary retention, which is a large prostate. But in someone whose prostate is otherwise in normal size and nothing else obstructing, they can still have evidence of detrusor hypocontractility or poor function to their bladder, and they can ultimately get voiding dysfunction and problems because of that, much as what we see here in the context of neurological disease as well. And then fecal incontinence. We all have to see these patients many times as neurosurgeons, neurologists, urologists. We don't screen for those patients well, and they're having significant accidents for bowel incontinence. So this is something, again, in this setting, it can be very appropriate, and it's indicated for sacral neuromodulation. So let's look a little bit more about optimizing our patient selection. As we all know, we typically talk about a history, excluding other factors that might be short-term factors. I don't think there's anything significantly relevant on a physical examination. In the neurological patient, we'll talk more, but in someone who's got a complete injury, I'm a little less excited than I am in many of these more partial injury patients. We do other basic studies. We do use a bladder diary. So I want to know how bad is their incontinence, if they're incontinent, or if they're in retention, are they catheterizing, and if so, how much, how often, because this is something that's very, very important. And again, we'll go into more details about that. I think many times it's helpful to partner with a urologist. Why? Because urologists may evaluate the outlet, see if there's something else going on. So using urodynamic studies and other things that can be very, very beneficial. So let's talk right about screening for patients with neurogenic-based issues. These are patients that all of you see every single day. This is something that we are looking at actively because there's dominant symptoms of urgency, leakage, urge frequency, or emptying problems, and as I mentioned, even fecal incontinence. So this is where we're more focused on that aspect, and many of you are more focused on, as you saw, ambulation and moving and so forth. And so all very important functional reconstructive opportunities. We see a lot of MS patients. This is a functional question as to whether or not that patient functionally can get to the bathroom. If I were to restore some of their bladder function, could they actually make it in time? Or if it takes them 3, 4, 5 minutes to get up and get to the bathroom, I don't know if these therapies are going to be helpful enough to make that difference between wet and dry if it takes that long to get to the bathroom. But in many cases, it can be 30, 45, 60 seconds, but that can be the difference in someone who's wet versus dry. So that's where we would also look at it. In the US, the majority of patients are refractory overactive bladder, so this is more idiopathic patients. And then certainly there's patients who may be using onabotulinum toxin or Botox injections inside the bladder, especially for detrusor overactivity or hyperactivity. But that way, many of those patients, especially the neurogenic patients, may need to do self-catheterization. So you can better manage their incontinence, but oftentimes at a cost, which means you'll be pushing them to not emptying well and then managing themselves with self-catheterization. Some patients are fine with that, and other patients not so fine with that. Let's look at lumbar disc disease. So lumbar disc disease, as we all know, there's quite a heterogeneous group. So some people have more severe disc disease than others, and the level of dysfunction and neurologic dysfunction can vary significantly, especially as we see it as a urologist in what level of lower tract symptoms that these people have. But those patients oftentimes are very disabled, not only from the pain and the issues that they have from their disc disease, but we see that from bladder overactivity, urgency, frequency, and/or incontinence. We typically like to see somewhat of an intact spinal cord. I was enjoying the discussion hearing on paraplegics. When we see patients, we know from mechanisms of action of sacral neuromodulation that there definitely is stimulation of various portions of the cerebral cortex. So we've seen that on PET scanning studies. When we turn the device on, various areas light up that definitely indicate that there needs to be some sort of an intact communication supratentorially. And as I mentioned, as best one can, good functional and/or ambulatory status is very, very helpful. So let's look at patients with retention. Can we do these patients? Absolutely. There's a few things I want to make sure. So if many of you see a patient, either a fresh motor vehicle accident, and they've now gone through their spinal shock phase, they're recovering, but their dominant symptoms either retention or can't empty, they start them on self-catheterizations. We're very insistent that they keep their overall bladder volumes to about 500 cc's or less. So if they're voiding a little bit, maybe they void 100 cc's, catheterize for 400 cc's. I can live with that. What we don't want to hear is the patient who says, I was never urinating, now I can urinate, and how much do they urinate? Maybe 50, maybe 100 cc's. And I said, okay, then you catheterize. Yes. How much do you leave over? 900, 1,000, like that's not good, because in our case, that's an overstretch of the bladder, an overflow of leakage, and those patients won't do well with any therapy that we have to offer. There's a shared decision-making opportunity, really seeing what we can do to help that patient improve their voluntary voiding, less and less left over with catheterizations, and then we can say we have a successful case. And there's a few other situations. So again, the important thing is that patients should not have a risk for a stretch injury or an over-distension injury, which is quite common. We see patients with a deep pelvic surgery, radical hysterectomies, abdominoperitoneal resections for colorectal cancer, and they get some level of distal denervation, and many of them in the hospital, no one will realize, but they said, oh, they took the catheter out in the morning, they haven't urinated, and now it's 8 p.m., and they realize that someone hasn't emptied. They see how much is left over in the bladder, maybe 2 liters, 1.5 liters. That's not a good situation, because those are difficult, if possible, to even manage. So I know we don't have that much time, but I'd just like to show you really how simple this therapy can be. This is a 2-stepped approach. The first step is a trial phase, and this gives you the opportunity to try the therapy for the patient, see how much improvement they get. We want to get some level of subjective improvement, but also objective. So this is, I alluded to, bladder diaries, getting one at baseline, getting a repeat after the STIM trial is done, so that we can see how much improvement. In the US, the Food and Drug Administration has set the threshold at 50% improvement. So if someone has 8 incontinence episodes a day, I want to see it at 4 or less. We sometimes get down to 0 or 1, but also those patients should understand it may only improve to 50%. We typically trial this for anywhere from 7 to 14 days. We typically try to get some level of lead, proximity to the S3 nerve root, in which case it goes in a medial to lateral configuration. We try to get all 4 electrode points to contact, and as we do, we can get some level of typically motor and or sensory symptoms to improve based on that. So let's just look very briefly at this animation. See if this comes up. Here we go. So this is using the Medtronic InterStim device. This is available here in India. They have the 10-year battery life as well. So this is a 2-stepped approach. The first step is actually placement of an MRI-compatible lead that's now available. That was not the case in recent times. So now you have the SureScan MRI-compatible lead that's available. So the 2-stepped approach can basically mean, why is this not advancing? It's not advancing. Oh, here it is now. So typically positioning the patient so that we can do fluoroscopy. We clean the patient in the typical fashion. Exposing the buttocks, because the S3 nerve innervation will typically be called a bellow contraction of the levator ani muscles and a toe flexion of the big toe. Those are the two responses that we would typically see. We have a grounding pad or grounding electrode, and then connecting that to that area, we then place what's called a foramen needle in the posterior aspect of the spine. This is just to use the therapy itself, connecting the actual components. And again, when I see kind of paddle leads and other therapies that you do for spinal cord stimulation, this is much simpler, much easier, much more straightforward in the approach for that. I'm actually going to go to the next video because I think that's going to be, this is more the live look when we do this. So we do simple measurements. We try to stay in the medial portion of the sacrum. So this is the S3 nerve foramen we're targeting. You can do a cross technique to basically show where S3 is. We're going to place these small foramen needles to ultimately get into S3. Now I'll tell you, based on this picture, it's actually a little bit low. Stimulation we get when we get S4, which is a little bit low, will typically be a bellows contraction, but no toe flexion. So in this case, the surgeon realized that that's probably a little bit too low, so angled the next needle to go a little higher, more cephalad, now showing that the needle is going into S3, achieving both the bellows and the toe contraction, as you can see here. And when you get that, you know that you're in the proper S3 nerve foramen. After the testing and the stimulation shows that we're in the right position, we basically take the stylet out. We're going to put something called a directional guide. So anyone who's done Seldinger technique-based therapies, including for central line placements and other things, this is very analogous to that. So we place that fluoroscopically with a small directional guide, exchange the lead wire, and then we're going to use a dilator. And this dilator allows us to puncture the fascial sheath that goes just to the ventral surface of the sacrum. So this is a pretty quick procedure. These procedures take about 30 to 45 minutes typically when we do this. So we're going to place that dilator right down that S3 nerve tract near the foramen. We remove the inner portion of the dilator, and then we're going to place the lead. And this lead is going to go in. The lead has a medial to lateral, or at least has a slight curve, and we're going to angle this to go medial to lateral because that's the direction of the S3 nerve, goes medial to lateral. So as best we can to get as much contact with the nerve as we possibly can. So we advance that to a certain white mark that knows that before the tines are deployed, we're able to test and expose the electrodes. We're going to then test, so this is a typical configuration of the electrodes, and then we test those intraoperatively. And this testing is basically looking for motor responses. We're not doing typically sensory responses during surgery anymore. Most of us stop that. So you can see both the toe contraction, as you see here, and a bellows contraction of the anal muscles right there. And so that shows that we are in the right position. We often, if not always, get 4 out of the 4 electrodes to respond at a low voltage or amplitude of 2 volts or less. And that's what we typically aim for. So this way, I know I'm in the right position, remove the dilator sheath, and then that's going to deploy the lead. I won't go into much detail after this, but we make a slight connection on the side for a percutaneous extension wire, and then use that as the trial. As I mentioned, 1 to 2 weeks is a typical trial duration. When we do that, we can usually see improvements based on their urgency, frequency, or urgent continence episodes. So in the idiopathic population, we see an 80 to 90% success rate. So 80 to 90% of the patients that we trial go on to the implant. The implant, as I mentioned, 1 to 2 weeks later is a standard IPG. This is now a 10-year battery life with the IPG that goes in the upper gluteal area. And so those things connect, and that's pretty much as far as it goes. So it's a pretty straightforward, simple, easy procedure. This is the neurostimulator implant. Like I said, it has a 10-year plus battery life now with the InterStim, which is the system that's approved here in India as well, and really works pretty well. We are fairly insistent in many things maybe all of you do in terms of infection, prevention, or minimization. So I just want to spend 1 or 2 minutes here talking about that because this is very important. We're operating in a technically dirtier area as we're near the gluteal area. Many of these patients who have fecal incontinence may have some soiling, so our risks of infection are definitely higher than we'd like to admit. This is a huge cost to the system because if I place this and I place the generator and 3 weeks later the patient has a significant erythema or tenderness, redness in that area, I have to explant that. And that patient has now incurred a significant cost. So it's very important for all of us to make sure that we don't get an infection. So this is something I would impress upon all of you in your own practices, including spinal cord stimulation and other areas to think about infection prevention and minimization. Unfortunately, none of our groups anywhere that I'm aware of have really come out with a consensus best practice statement to show how to minimize that. We all have our own experiences, and I'll show you some of ours. The typical infection rates were anywhere between 2 and 5%. So we started to standardize our protocol. And now in the last 1,000, we've got our infection rate down to 1.6%. So that's probably as good as we're going to get. I don't think we're going to get too much better. There's no opportunity to really do a randomized control trial. The other challenge is because we have the percutaneous extension wire that's coming out of the skin for 1 to 2 weeks, that's a conduit for bacteria to go from the outside in. And so there is some risks of that. We've been using chlorhexidine and alcohol-based preps. I think that's the most important thing, and there's data that shows that in cardiac pacemakers and other therapies that at least an alcohol-based prep makes a difference. And then lastly, just going to show you preoperative antibiotics. We've typically gone to first generation cephalosporin as the main first step. Surgical site preparation, as I mentioned, we're going to typically use an alcohol-based chlorhexidine prep. We do this for 3 to 5 minutes to really make sure that this prep goes on well, stays on well, dries, and then also persists for after the surgery itself. I like to use an Ioban Drake because it allows me to prevent my hands from touching other parts of the gluteal area and then touching mechanical devices that we're then implanting. We used to do an antibiotic solution. Now we use a chlorhexidine-based solution as well to irrigate that. And lastly, a no-touch technique. So when the implantable pulse generator is ultimately going in, no one touches it except for the surgeon. We all use clean gloves, so we already have changed gloves, and that goes right immediately into the pocket. So we do the pocket creation, everything else first before the generator goes in and is touched. And then lastly, we've been using about 3 days of an oral antibiotic, typically trimethoprim sulfa, to minimize infections as well. So I'll conclude there. Hopefully you've seen now the therapy. It's simple, it's fairly effective. I'd like to use the next few minutes to answer any questions as to what's on your mind in ways that you can do this in your patient population. We use this very routinely. As I mentioned, most of our patients are idiopathic, not neurogenic patients, but the indications would really be not neurogenic bladder, but more urgency, frequency, incontinence, fecal incontinence, or retention is their dominant symptom. Thank you very much. And my contact information here, always happy to answer emails, Twitter, or cell phone.